so there's a pretty large discrepancy in pay. So the first woman that I'll talk about is Siva Mal, and she was one of my favorite women to interview because she is really unique in the way that she approaches the situations that happen in her village. So she is the Mopan's daughter-in-law, and the Mopan for the Irula is the village headman, or the man that's making all of the decisions in the village. So most women that are the daughter-in-law of the Mopan are really submissive and soft-spoken, and Siva Mal is the complete opposite of that. So we would frequently have drunk men come and interrupt our interviews, and she would jump up and yell at them and like chase them away. And it would always take her like 15 minutes to answer a question because she would go off on these super long tangents. So she was really fascinating, and she was the mother of 3 of the children that I taught at the school. And Siva Mal is also the only woman in the presentation whose name has not been changed. So she wanted people to know that these were her stories, and so the images that I will show of her are also of her and not someone else. So Siva Mal is the one standing here. And I'm just going to go into kind of a little bit of background about each of the women and then tell a couple of the stories that they shared with me. So Siva Mal is originally from a village called Kulikor, which is on the Kerala side of Anakati. She has what they call in India a love marriage, which means that it wasn't arranged by her parents. And that is actually really common in tribal India, but not as much in the rest of India. So for most of India, it's still about 80% of marriages are arranged. 3 out of the 4 women that I interviewed had love marriages, to kind of give you an idea of how the tribal community is different. So Siva Mal was living in Kulikor when she met her husband, and I was trying to ask her about how a love marriage works because I only knew about arranged marriages. And her exact quote was, "My husband came in an auto rickshaw, he looked at me and smiled at me, and then we got married." So a love marriage in India still really differs from what we would consider a love marriage here, and so there's no process of dating or no process of actually falling in love. You just see someone across the room, decide that you want to get to know them better, and in India the only way to do that is to get married. So they did that. And originally his family was really unsupportive of their marriage, and so she and her husband decided to live with her parents, which is rare. Usually they would go and live with the man's parents. And it wasn't until their first son, Vishnu Prabhu, was born that they moved over to Padur, which is the village that she's living in now. So her oldest child is the one in the middle. His name is Vishnu Prabhu, and he was one of the students in the class that I was the class teacher for. So once the Mopan of Kandanur Padur heard that he had a grandson, he was suddenly interested in restarting relationships with Siva Mal and her husband. So they moved over to Kandanur, and that is where they're living now. Siva Mal stopped going to school when she was in the 5th grade because her parents had twins, and they needed someone to stay at home and take care of the infants. So at age 10, she was left alone with her 2 twin, baby brother and sister, and then there was a 2-year-old that she had to care for as well. So she was basically raising the 3 of those kids. She also said that she never really understood school, and so she was kind of relieved when her parents asked her to stop. Her exact quote on that was, "Before we did not have enough money. Now when I see children studying, I don't remember anything. Even if I go to school, I should study, no? They used to beat a lot, and I did not get these studies in my head. All of the teachers will beat." So a really common problem in India is that the schools there are really violent, and that's actually the reason a lot of kids stop studying. And so Vidya, Vanam, the school that I was at, had a policy about that, and so the violence in that school was minimal. It would only be like a slap on the wrist if the kids weren't listening. And so a lot of kids from the government school have switched over to that school because of that. So Siva Mal now works in the brick kilns because of 5th grade education. That's pretty much the only job that she has access to in her village. So she works in the brick kilns, and this was one of the first moments where I realized that the concepts of oppression, as I understood it, really didn't translate into these interviews. So I kept asking her if it was frustrating that the men made 1/3 more money than she did for doing the same work. And she just kept looking at me and saying no. And this happened for 5 minutes, and then I just kind of was like, okay, we're not going to get anywhere with that question. But her reasoning was that the men are doing harder labor because they're the ones lifting the bricks after they've been baked, and so they're significantly heavier at that point. So she was really not bothered by that. She was bothered, though, by the way that the brick kilns operate, and this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about the kilns. So the way that the kilns function is they will pay people in advance up to 50,000 rupees, even though they only make 100 rupees per day. And then they will make it so that you're permanently indebted to the kilns so that you always have to work that labor off. The problem with that is that most people in their lifetime can't work the labor off, and so they have a system set up so that their children would inherit that debt. So a lot of the students that I have at my school have inherited debt from their parents in the kilns because they are no longer able to work. So something that Vidya Vanam has done since then is start paying that debt off and trying to subsidize those payments. And then we're starting a vocational school to deter children from going into the kilns. So another interesting story that Siva Mal shared with me was the birth of her twin daughters. So we were kind of asking her if she went to the hospital, because there is a tribal hospital in the area, or if she chose to have her kids at home. And for her first child, for Vishnu Prabhu, they went to the hospital, but for the twins, they didn't have the money, so they had them at home, which is actually really common in that area, so most women know how to midwife. However, when Siva Mal went into labor, Vishnu Priya, who's this one, got stuck, and when you're in a tribal village where there's not a whole lot of resources, that usually means that both the mother and the baby are going to die. So her mother-in-law ran outside and grabbed her husband and said that your wife is going to die. So her husband ran into the delivery room, which is not acceptable at all in India, and reached in and pulled her out. And so, I mean, she's clearly fine now. But they also did not know that she was pregnant with twins, and so the second twin was born still inside the placenta. So he had to run outside again, grab an axe, and split the placenta open. She also is fine now. But Siva Mal told the story like it was the most normal story ever. And then, to justify her husband's participation in the story, she told me, my husband, when he was studying in class 12, he used to dissect cockroaches, so he had some experience. Which I'm not really sure where she was going with that, but she seemed to think that he was qualified to deliver the babies. So the next woman that I'll talk about is Suji. Suji is one of my coworkers and probably the woman that I'm closest with out of all of the ones that I interviewed. She grew up in Kandanur, which is a village that's about half a kilometer away from where Siva Mal lives now. And then she moved into Padur after her arranged marriage. Ironically, given the idea that we have about arranged marriage, Suji is probably the happiest married out of the 4 women that I talked to. But she unfortunately was widowed before she was 30 years old and was left with her 3 children. And so something that we talked a lot about when we did her interview was the story of her husband's death and sort of how that affected her. And she said the main way that people changed when they talked to her in the village was that men would never help her with something unless they conditioned that action on her reciprocating with sexual favors. And so this is something that she has dealt with for a really long time. But since then, she has been employed at Vidya Vanam, and the men don't bother her anymore because they see her as an economically independent woman, which is great. But she was telling us about her husband's death and said that she didn't leave her house for the first 3 years after he died because she wasn't able to face people in the village. So she said, now I'm not like that, but they took care of me every second. I never used to look at my children. I would simply be grieving. Only my mother and my mother-in-law took care of the children. All these 3 years, I did not even cook. My mother-in-law cooked all these 3 years every single day. And that's something that you normally don't see. Usually a mother-in-law is not very supportive, and actually once Suji was able to come out of her house and sort of be on her own, her mother-in-law abandoned her and doesn't talk to her anymore because she has 2 other sons who have families that she feels the need to be involved with. And the story of how her husband's death happened was really tragic as well. So her husband was known as the community mediator. So he was the one in the village that would solve problems for people when they got into conflict. And so one day, a boy who was working in the city had stolen money from his boss because his family couldn't afford food. But the boss caught him, and so he detained them in the city. And they asked Suji's husband to go and sort of sort out this conflict. So Suji's husband with 4 other men from the village drove to Coimbatore on motorbikes, and they sorted out the conflict, and right as they were leaving, the first 2 motorbikes left, and then Suji and the boy who had been in trouble, Suji's husband and that boy were on the last motorbike. And as they were leaving, a family member that was related to the man that he had stolen from came out and tipped the bike while they were trying to pull away. And so the rod that, if you were to climb onto a motorbike, the rod that you would step onto broke up and hit him in the temple. And so they got hold of the rest of the group, but they were already halfway back to Anakati, and so they had to bike all the way back. And by the time they got up there to try and help him, he was already doing really poorly. And then when they took him to the hospital, the first 3 hospitals they went to denied service because the other men had been drinking. And in India, they have a policy that if you're drinking, they withhold service. So it took 4 tries to get him to a hospital where he actually received treatment. And Suji's quote about that process is, "6 of them from our village went, and none of them returned. All were men, so we did not worry. The next morning it was 10 a.m. when we got the news. At that time, Krishna was drinking milk. He was very young. My husband had reached coma stage. We had a doctor whom we knew in the hospital. But they did not tell me this because I had a baby. So every day for 5 consecutive days, I used to go visit him in the hospital and then come back. Since Krishna was here, I had to come home. So on the 5th day, I was here at home, and they told me. And after that, I told you. I did not come out of the house for 3 years. I used to stay inside the house." So her husband's brother is the one who came and told her that they had been in an accident, but they didn't know how to tell her that in front of the kids, so they told her that he was fine. And then when she got to the hospital, he was already in a coma. So something that's really hard is that with the level of education that Suji had, she wasn't able to do a whole lot because she wasn't able to teach at the school, and she couldn't work in the kilns because she had 3 children to care for. So she started teaching what they call Sandhya Gurukulam, which means evening knowledge, and it's tutoring classes to the children in the village. And the local ashram paid her to do that, which is a Hindu religious center, hired her to do that. And then when her 2 youngest sons enrolled at Vidya Vanam, they found out that she had been teaching Sandhya Gurukulam, and they hired her on as the project director. And so Vidya Vanam has a program where a lot of women work there on craft type things. So they make pillowcases and placemats, and they harvest honey, and they just do a bunch of different craft work. So Suji did that originally, and then Pati, the director of the school, asked her to move into the Montessori, where she is now teaching. So she is now also involved in a class called IGNU, which is an open schooling course at Vidya Vanam, and it's empowering local women to speak English better than they do now, and she is about to graduate from that. She hardly spoke English when I got there, and we could carry on a conversation by the time I left. So given the circumstance, she is doing really well. And she says the main thing that her village needs at this point is water, because a wealthy person moved into the village and built their borehole right next to the pipe that leads into the village, so now the whole village doesn't have drinking water. So they're allowed to hike out to his farm and fill their water from his borehole, but that's about 2 kilometers away, and she has to do that walk 8 times a day. So water is the main thing that both her and Cedar Mall said that they needed. Okay, so the next woman I interviewed is Vanita. And Vanita is the parent of another 3 of my students, which is how I know her. And her daughter's coming of age ceremony is the one that I got to attend while I was in India, and I will talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Vanita's story is really unique because she is actually not Irula by birth. She is part of the Malayali Gounder tribe, which is just located across the border in Kerala. And when she decided to marry into the Irula tribe, her family completely cut her off and stopped talking to her. And so even now, 18 years later, her father still doesn't talk to her, and her mother has to come and visit her in secret because her father would not approve of it. So Vanita is now living in the Irula tribe, and they have fully accepted her as one of their own children. So she got married when she was 16, had her first child when she was 18, her second when she was 23, and her third when she was 25. And we talked a lot about sort of how the relationship with her family at home changed because they completely cut her out of her life, or out of their lives, which is not something that happens super frequently in India. And so I asked her if she ever regretted making that sacrifice, and she told me that for a while in the beginning she did, because 2 months into her marriage, her husband started drinking a lot, and with his drinking came a lot of domestic violence. So she told me, "My husband, soon after my marriage, for 2-3 months, did not drink. Then he started consuming alcohol and picking up quarrels with others, so it was difficult then." She also expanded on her husband's drinking and told us about a couple instances where there were domestic violence problems in the house, but both her mother-in-law and father-in-law defended her, which again is not something that you would normally see in India. Usually the mother-in-law would side with her son or would encourage her son to reprimand his wife if she wasn't behaving appropriately. So the fact that they have taken her in as one of their own children is really unique, and I think really helps the situation that she is in. Luckily for her, her situation has also changed significantly. About 9 years ago, her husband, this sounds terrible, but hear me out for a second. Her husband was bitten by a dog, and in India there's a belief that if you get bitten by a dog, you have to stop consuming meat, alcohol, and tamarind. and he was like terrified that he was going to die, so he just stopped drinking.